On today's episode, we're taking a listener question around savings rate. What is it? Why is it important? And how do I calculate it? Welcome to the ultimate crowdsourced personal finance show. This is Choose FI.
You're listening to Choose FI Radio. The blueprint for financial independence lives here. If you're looking to unlock the secrets to financial independence and early retirement, you're in the right place. Stay tuned and join a community of like-minded people who are getting off the hamster wheel and taking control of their lives in the pursuit of financial independence. Choose FI, your home for financial independence online.
Very excited to dive into this week's episode and help me with this. I have my co-host Brad here with me today. How you doing, buddy?
Hey, Jonathan, I am doing quite well. Yeah, what's going on by you?
You know, we're about to start recording and I hear the thunder, the pitter-patter of feet coming up the stairs. And I'm like, oh, that's my daughter. And then there's heavier feet. And I'm like, oh, it's more than one. It's they come barging through the door and then my wife is right behind them. And I'm like, man, I'm glad I didn't hit recording yet. But, you know, I took the headphones off and I looked to the right, greeted with a smile, and man, their eyes were absolutely lit up. And they were telling me that the butterfly garden, we had gotten this little kit from Toys That Teach. Once you purchase it, they'll actually send you the butterflies. The butterflies are caterpillars at the time. They consume a certain amount of meal and then they immediately start forming their chrysalis. They do all of this within about a 1 month period, and it kind of like walks you through it. And so my kids are kind of watching this process. And anyways, we had 5 of them. And this morning, the first butterfly came out of the chrysalis. They wanted me to come down and see, which is why we were late getting started. They fed the now butterfly some sugar water, and they're off to figure out how we can bring more butterflies into our backyard.
Oh, man, that's cool. Science at life here in the Mendoza backyard. I like it.
That's right. Toys That Teach for the win. We have a cool little store in the area called Toys That Teach, and this was one that came from them. So a little shout out.
Yeah, Jonathan, I love the science at work. That's very, very cool. It actually reminds me of this thing I haven't mentioned that's actually like kind of STEM related that my younger daughter, Molly, and I do. So my mom actually found, you know how there are a bunch of those like, I don't know, projects in a box that you can order and they come like once a month. We've done that in the past and they've always been like kind of cool, kind of mediocre. But my mom actually got Molly this as a present recently. It's called KiwiCo, Kiwico. And this is the Eureka Crate. And I have to say, this is like the single best thing we've ever done as one of these gifts, first off, but like as a family, it's just so much fun. It's like, I went to their website while we were talking here. It's an engineering box, put science to work and engineer amazing projects. And they say it's for ages 12 to 100, which is kind of funny. But Molly's 10 and she loves these things. We've made so many cool projects. So the one that just showed up in the mail yesterday was like a wooden ukulele. We've done, was it a perpetual calendar, a dual lantern and flashlight?
Oh, wow.
And goodness, it's so many of these things that we have. An articulating arm on like a lamp for your desk. It's just the wildest things. So anyway, this is something I've been doing like with Molly for the last handful of months, and we love it. She like freaks out when it shows up in the mail. So for anybody looking for one of these things, yeah, it's the Eureka Crate from KiwiCo. I highly, highly recommend it.
You know, back in the day, a long, long time ago, I used to listen to the Tim Ferriss podcast, and I was an email subscriber for a long time as well. And I would remember that, ostensibly you're talking about life optimization, but every once in a while you would just get these like random recommendations out of nowhere at the bottom of an email list. And I would just, let me go see what's going on here. So that's cool, man. I just went and checked it out. Hopefully somebody gets some value from that. KiwiCo for the win. Yeah. I love how a lot of these STEM things do not have to be necessarily on a computer, right? Like projects that you can get your hands into and projects that you can do with your parents. It's really, really cool stuff.
Yeah. Agreed.
All right. So today we're going to get right to it. We have an awesome, fantastic question. I'll give it back to you. Brad, we're going to be talking about savings rate.
Yeah. So Ben sent us an email a couple of weeks ago, and it was so succinct, but so wonderful that we just thought it would make a great episode. So he said, when trying to achieve a savings rate of 50% of your income, is that a percentage of your net or your gross income? Also, does adding money to a 401k count in that, or is that separate from the quote savings of 50%? Thanks. So 2 lines, 2 sentences in essence. But Jonathan, that's an entire episode in 2 sentences.
I will take your 2-sentence question and turn it into an hour-long conversation.
But how important is that, right? Like we talk about the time to FI, the FI calculation, and the savings rate, and how it all ties together. And really, to have any meaningful sense of where am I on my timeline to FI, you have to roughly know what your savings rate is. And if you don't even know the first starting point, like net or gross income, which this is a brilliant question because who would know that, right? Like, what is the definition of savings rate when I see that calculator of, oh, it's 17 years to FI if I save 50%? Well, what the heck is 50%, right? So it's really important that we talk through this. And there's no precise exact answer. And of course, we'll talk about this over the next 30, 40 minutes, but it's really important to dial down into something that gets you most of the way there. And I think it's actually pretty easy at its essence, but once you're armed with the knowledge, right?
Yeah. So what's interesting is I thought to myself, man, have we could just send them a response that we've done in this past. And I went to find one and I went and listened to it and I was like, oh, that wasn't super helpful.
We weren't so good back then.
That wasn't our best content. So I was like, let's do better. And so
no reference to the episode number here.
I could, but I'm not going to. Oh, anyways, we're going to try to do a really good job today, and we're going to try and do it in a couple different ways. So I realize that some of this is visual. So Brad and I, ahead of this, as we're releasing this episode, we've worked really hard to take the core ideas from this episode and work them into an article. And you can, it's just going to be the show notes for this episode. You'll be able to find it at choosify.com/375. I would really encourage you, listen to this episode, but also go check out this article. What you need is going to be there. It's going to cement this. And like we talk about a lot of big ideas on this show, and we usually try to encourage you to do something with those ideas. If it's track your finances, let's track our finances. Let's spot check our tax assessment. Let's take small actions. This is one of those that it's not going to be a huge time burden, especially if it's built on some of the other things that we've talked about since the beginning of the year. But if you do this, it'll have massive impact for you going forward. So probably the surest way I'll be more confident that you're likely to take action on this is if you just go check out this article, choosify.com/375. Okay, so let's hop into it. How to calculate your savings rate, why it's important, what is it? We'll start with this definition. And the thing is, we can actually do a very precise definition right out the gate. Your savings rate, quite simply, is what you save divided by what you earn, what your income is. Whatever comes out on the other side will be a decimal, and we can multiply it times 100 to give us a percentage. That is your savings rate. Now, Brad, that can both be very precise and totally unusable.
And completely meaningless. Yeah, but right. At its essence, this is really simple. That's the takeaway from this part is savings over income gets you, like you said, Jonathan, a decimal. So let's say you made 100 grand, you save 40. So 40,000 divided by 100,000 equals 0.4. And that's a 40% savings rate. So at its absolute essence, it really is that simple. What are my savings? How much am I earning? Just do one simple math equation and boom, you've got it.
Now we're going to talk about the problems with that because obviously I think you guys can hear there's a bunch of asterisks going on in our mind, and it doesn't actually get to the heart of Ben's question. But before we do that, let's just talk about why it's important generally and why we spend so much time talking about it inside the financial independence community. Maybe even we put more focus here than maybe you even see in other places. And Brad, I'll give this back to you. But the one that I want to talk about to begin with is the retirement calculators that you see on traditional personal finance sites everywhere. What do I need to retire?
Yeah, this is something that I get rather up in arms about. So traditional retirement calculators are, in my estimation, all based on a fundamentally flawed starting point, which is your current income. And realistically, your current income has absolutely nothing to do with your retirement at all. Literally nothing. What actually is important to determine if you can retire is, what does my life cost? And really, probably more appropriately, what will my life cost when I'm at that point of retirement or financial independence or whatever we want to call it? So it has quite literally nothing to do with your current income, right?
Right, right. Because let's just be very clear on this. This isn't academic. This isn't a mathematical formula. It's just quite simply when you can fund the cost of your life from a source other than your employer, you've unlocked financial freedom.
Right. And other than your employer, which is the critical part there, right? So you are not trying to replace your current income because by definition, built into your current income, if you think you're ever going to be able to retire, ever, there has to be some savings rate, right? So let's say, again, you made 100 grand, but you spent 100 grand. You will literally never be able to retire, right? That's just a mathematical certainty because you have no money. So therefore, that shows how, again, how fundamentally flawed starting with your current income is because it's irrelevant, right? Based on your current income, there is obviously, and by definition, there has to be some savings built into there. And also, when you're at peak earning, that's going to be most likely when you pay the highest taxes, right? So that is also a significantly higher, artificially higher number if you're looking just at your current income. But again, that's not what you're trying to replace. That's not the end goal here. The end goal of financial independence or retirement is, can I have these other sources? And that could be quote unquote passive income or real estate income or whatever. But for most people, many people, it will be, can I pull a certain percentage out of my investable assets every year to cover my life expenses? That is all you need to take away from this. It's, I need to replace what my life costs. I need to replace my current expenses in that year of retirement.
Right. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about increasing our income, but really when it comes to doing our projections, we're very interested in how much our life actually costs. So a lot of the conversations that we've had coming into this conversation have been around tracking and budgeting, being aware of what your structural expenses actually are, and on the other side, getting an accurate picture of what our income actually is, because it's going to give you more information. But now what we're doing is we're saying, what is our savings rate? And Brad, you threw this, fantastic little nugget of statistics in there. And it's most math that you need for financial independence should be able to be done on the back of a napkin. And here it is. If you spend everything you make, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, you will never be able to retire, right?
No, never.
If you can save just 1% of your income, while that is infinitely better than the prior picture, the problem is it would take you literally 99 years just to replace 1 year of expenses, right? So yes, with a long enough timeline, it will happen eventually. You just might not live to see it. And this kind of moves us to where, when we're talking about traditional savings rates, like kind of common personal finance wisdom is, hey, if you save somewhere in between 10 to 20%, you're doing really good. And the math on that bears out but we need to find out why. Like, why is that decent advice for people that are just pursuing a traditional retirement age? And again, it's going back to savings rate. We kind of charted it out on the back of the napkin here, but if we work through this analogy, if you're at a 10% savings rate, then every 9 years you work, you've replaced a year of income. If you're at a 25% savings rate, then every 3 years you've worked, you've replaced a year of income. If you're at a 50% savings rate, then every year that you work, you have produced another year of income. Now, for the 10 to 20% savings rate crowd, the traditional personal finance recommendations, we can map out how long, based on your savings rate, it's going to take you to reach financial independence. So at a 10%, and there's some assumptions in there about what sort of return you're going to get, et cetera. And assuming you don't have any net worth, like a lot of other assumptions. But just, if we were going to use this back of the envelope assumption math, 5% in real returns, and you're going to live on some sort of 4% safe withdrawal rate, a 10% savings rate will get you to financial independence in 51 years. A 20% will knock that down to 37 years. So for someone that's starting out at the age of 30 and is planning on working for 40 to 50 years, then yeah, 10%, 20%, it's going to work okay. The problem is people never question whether or not you can do more than that.
Right. And for many people, 10 to 20% seems like an impossible goal, right? The way it's talked about, sadly, that, in a perfect world, you save 10 to 20%. Obviously, in the financial independence community, we try to surpass that by a significant margin. But like you said, realistically, okay, somebody saves 20%. It's 37 years to get to that point where they're financially independent. They start at 22, they're 59. I mean, that's putting you ahead of the vast majority of people. So, I think that's probably almost like table stakes is, can you save that 20% for, like you said, the traditional personal finance? Again, We're not trying to paint a bleak picture here. It's just at its essence, it's math. Like we said, if you save 0 or 1%, you are not going to live long enough really to get to that point of 5. Even if you save 10%, like you said, Jonathan, it's 51 years of work, 51 years. So even if you start at 22, I mean, 73, that's less than ideal, obviously. So I think for me, just looking at this, most people at 59 are not at that point. So the vast majority of people are not saving 20%. But again, like we said, that's not the point of aspiration for people in the financial independence community, and why we think savings rate is so critical, because it is tied inexorably with this years to 5 calculation. And you need to have a sense of where are you on this journey. And of course, it's different for everybody, right? There's nuance. As you said, really, you're not going to just look at this and say, okay, I'm starting at 0. I all of a sudden have a 50% savings rate. So from this point, I'm 17 years to 5. Like, that's not a realistic thing, because everyone has a different life. Everybody has nuance. You're coming into this with maybe some net worth. Maybe you have some debt. Maybe your savings rate is X% today, but you think you can get there in a year. So obviously there's nuances, but it's important to look at the hard numbers and say, okay, I conceptually understand this. And I think this is actually really hopeful. No matter who I am, no matter when I'm starting, this is not just for perfect people starting at 22. It's not. The math is true no matter when you're starting or who you are. If you're starting from a $0 net worth and you have a 50% savings rate, you are 17 years to 5. And that is a marvelous thing. It really, really is. And don't ever lose sight of that.
Yeah, I think the other thing people do is we fall into the trap of saying, like, well, how much should I be saving each month? And like when you use that terminology specifically, you're looking for a dollar amount. And the problem is, like, we don't have enough information, right? It's hard when someone says how much, like, just give me a number. Just give me a number to save each month. It's misleading. It's probably going to be inaccurate because it's depending on your goals. It's going to depend on how much your life actually costs. Like, it's going to be baked on a bunch of things that we might not have going into the conversation. For context, let's say someone is bringing home $100,000 a year. Like, for that individual that has, hey, if I save $2,000 a year, is that going to be enough? Well, the inference is that they're spending the other 98,000. Right. In that scenario, $2,000 a year saving, it's not really making a dent. In that case, we're talking about a 2% savings rate. Now, if you're taking the Susie Orman work until you die investment strategy, then yeah, it's going to be fine, but it's not really a strategy to win if you're, by the way, the work until you die is an actual retirement strategy.
Seriously? Oh,
not advised, but I'm just saying. I do know
please
people.
Don't do that.
I do know people that, I'm just going to work until I die. I was like, anyways. What if we want to unlock financial independence in, a period of 10 to 20 years? To Brad's point, that can be done. It can be done. If you start talking about a 30, 40, 50, 60% savings rate, you're going to obliterate any sort of societal norm or standard about how long you have to work to reach any particular point in time. We need to stop thinking about necessarily dollar amounts and go get the information about what our potential is, what our opportunity is, and think about things in terms of what percentage of my income can I save. And that really tees us up to go back to the nuance that we really led this conversation with, how to calculate your savings rate. We said, all right, it's simple. It's just savings divided by income. But this is the problem. What is income, Brad?
That is a good question, Jonathan. I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways to look at this. And I know you have a couple scenarios lined up here, but there are a bunch of different starting points. The most obvious one is just, hey, what's my salary, right? I make $100,000 a year. That's my income, right? I have to assume that's starting point A for the simplest way to look at this.
Right. So you have your salary, but are we looking at your salary before taxes or after taxes? I mean, we're going to actually continue to add some nuance on here, but this is a really important point of distinction. If you want to say, all right, well, what are my savings? Are you talking about your pre-tax savings, your after-tax savings? Are those the same? How do you should you be doing anything differently with those? Maybe we have debts, or maybe we have money that we're saving, but it's not going towards an investment account. How should we consider that?
Yeah, again, lots of nuance. And yeah, just like that last one that you mentioned, I mean, a mortgage payment every month, there are different components of that, right? And we don't think about it like that. Most of us don't. We just send off our mortgage payment. But there's a significant portion of that that's interest, and there's a significant portion of that which is principal, right? Which from a very strong perspective, can be considered savings because that is increasing your net worth. No matter how you look at it, that is money. Sure, it's not going into an investment per se. You're not investing it in the stock market, but that is money that's not being frivolously spent. It's not an expense. It's really an increase to your net worth. So, I mean, for me, since you brought up something like that, for me, that is included in my personal savings rate calculation. And I think that's what's cool about this is, and to Ben's question, ultimately is what's the precise definition? And I think the punchline is there is no exact precise definition because there is nuance to this and everybody's situation is different. And how the level of detail you want to go into is really up to you at the end of the day. But we are going to present a bunch of different options as to, okay, what's the 80-20 analysis? How can I get the vast majority of the benefit of this without spending 50 hours trying to figure out to get it as precise as possible? Like that's not really going to benefit you. But what level of detail and nuance do you want to get into? I think that ultimately is up to you. But Jonathan, it's up to me and you to try to present it the best we can to give people an idea of what their options even are.
Right. And the key there is like, we're going to talk about calculating your personal savings rate, right? And this is the thing. It's personal, but even more than that, like it's really not great as a comparative tool between you and someone else because you don't know what variables they're using. Not that I think that anybody's walking around bragging about their 70% savings rate, except in very, very small circles. But in general, it is a useless number for you to go out and compare yourself to a neighbor unless you know how that calculation is actually made. It is extraordinarily useful for you to use as a trend line for yourself year over year.
Hey, this is Andrew from the Choose FI team. Hope you're enjoying the show. We're going to get right back to it after these quick messages.
Now, how you actually calculate it, we're going to go ahead and map out a scenario here. We've done a little bit of prep work just to make sure we can hopefully convey a story with numbers. And it's a challenge, always a challenge. Sometimes we do it, sometimes we don't. But here's the scenario. We have a couple, they filed joint. So they're filing joint, which, there's some, that changes the standard deduction, changes their tax implications as opposed to single. We're trying to come up with numbers that are just easy to hear, but the math should still work for you if your numbers are differently. So we have a couple that's making $100,000 a year combined. They're married. They filed joint. In 2022, the 401k limits have gone up to $20,500. So they're able to max out between the two of them one 401k. And then they have to pay their tax burden on the remainder. And I did calculate that. These numbers don't really mean anything to you, but it's around $6,000 to federal state tax, around $7,000 in Social Security. They have a state tax, which this couple happened to be in Virginia, and it was around $3,000. Anyways, their take-home pay after they funded their 401k and after they paid their tax obligations and their health insurance, which we zeroed out. But in reality, there's probably some other deductions that are being done by the company. But this couple's take-home pay after all of those, company deductions and taxes was $62,032. So that is what they actually saw in their paycheck over the course of a year. So with that information, we can now take a couple different approaches to the savings rate, and we can share with you how, depending on what approach they made, how their savings rate would actually change.
So yeah, Jonathan, so that makes sense of what their gross income is, the 100,000, and their take home amount, which is the $62,032, which, kind of random. We should probably just round to 62,000.
No, my math is based on 62,032.
And I guess, so you said they maxed out one 401k. So they're saving at least 20,500. Do they have any additional savings built in?
Great question. I was trying to keep the math simple, but on my terms, and they were able to save an additional $9,500. So their total savings, and it's a combination of pre-tax and post-tax in this case, their total savings was $30,000 that they were able to save over the course of the year on a salary of $100,000.
Okay. So nice round numbers there at least, which is good.
All right. Assuming that actually teases up. Now, most people, when they heard that, probably said, oh, okay, they had a 30% savings rate. And that is a perfectly fine way to calculate your savings rate. It's what they saved, $30,000, divided by what they made, which was $100,000. It's 30%. That is scenario one. Now, we can move forward. What if they wanted to say instead, the way I want to calculate my savings rate is what did I save divided by what I had available to spend. So this is the difference between using your gross income versus your net income or your take-home pay. So what they saved in this scenario was still the $30,000, but they're saying, but I didn't have any of that. All I ever saw was the 62,000. And so in this case, they're taking 30,000 and they're dividing it by that 62,032. And that in this case has increased their savings rate from the 30% that we used in scenario 1 to 48% while not really changing anything else. It's just how they happen to do the math. Now, I know you as an accountant, Brad, immediately had some red flags on case 2, but I just want to point out when framed through the lens of what I had available to spend versus what I saved, you could see how someone could end up landing there.
Yeah, I can. And right, when you showed this to me the first time, my head kind of exploded because it seemed rather odd, to put it mildly. But let's go back to option number 1, right? Well, that is the least nuanced way. It's also the most conservative way. And there's no way to say that it's wrong, right? Like I saved 30,000, we made 100,000. So therefore, I have a 30% savings rate. Like that obviously would take you a minute or 2 to figure out. And that's not a bad, when you're talking about directional accuracy. And this is what you talked about before, which is really important. I wanted to drill down on it, is there's no predictive value in comparing your savings rate to somebody else because they're going to do it their own way. And it could be dramatically differently. Even Jonathan, as you mentioned, this one couple, just in these first 2 methods, which probably we would not advise either of these as the final method, but we'll get to that later. But they could have either a 30% or a 48% savings rate based on the exact same life, just looking at the math slightly different. So therefore, you would not want to compare your savings rate with somebody else in the FI community because they could have calculated it so dramatically differently that it doesn't do anything. There's no value in that. But what's really important is that, and this is my accountant's hat, is that you are consistent for your own calculation year over year. So as long as you're consistent, then you can look at that trend line. You can have a sense of where am I today? Where was I last year? Where was I in the past? And also get a sense of potentially where am I going in the future? So I would not advise to dramatically overhaul your savings rate calc year over year. You should keep it as consistent as you can. Obviously, if you get brand new information that you realize, oh, I messed this up, well, don't keep doing it erroneously just for fun. But in general, try to keep as consistent as possible. So anyway, that's my little sidebar PSA, obviously. But going back to the scenario. So, okay, scenario 1, I think makes sense from a perspective, right? Savings over your gross income. And this gets back to Ben's question is, do I use gross income? Do I use net income? Now, in your scenario number 2, which I think is kind of ridiculous and I hope nobody uses, please don't use this.
If you're using it, it's fine. Let's just fix it.
Let's fix it.
We can fix scenario 2 by making a small adjustment.
Yes, very small adjustment. And that probably brings us to a hypothetical scenario 3,
Scenario 3.
I'm way ahead of you. So, right, scenario 2, I think is silly because, so take home pay. And I think what you were getting at with this and what people who might use a method like this are trying to get at is, hey, this is the money that I get. I look at one paycheck, right? And let's say I get paid twice a month. So I get 24 paychecks a year. I just take the amount that hits my bank account and I multiply by 24, right? And that gets me my take home pay. And that's really the amount of money that I can spend. Isn't that actually what I should be using for income? This would be the argument.
Well, and even more than that, in terms of going from 1 to 2, let me just add this on because you're going to fix this, but let's not leave the extra thing about 2 that makes it more compelling. You're at your peak tax years while you're earning, right? And so for you to move towards 2, you're saying, this is the highest in taxes I will ever pay. Why would I want to base my savings rate around something that won't be there after I retire? It's artificially pushing it too low. So that was what would drive someone to number 2 over number 1.
Yes, I agree. And I think they're on the right path. So I agree with the fact that you should net out your taxes. And that's what Ben was getting at in his question. So I think what this scenario number 2 does incorrectly is they also netted out the amount that they contributed to their 401k, right? So they artificially reduced their 100,000 of gross income. Sure, they took the taxes out, but they also took the 20,500 out of the denominator of their income to get down to this 62,000, which is too low. You can't have it both ways, in essence. You can't say, hey, the denominator is this, and look at how great I was. I saved 30,000. But guys, 20,500 of that was part of that, should be part of that denominator, in essence. So, I mean, really, if this person wants to say, hey, I had take home income of 62,000, but really, they only saved 9,500 of that, if we're being honest. Their savings rate, if they want to say of my take home pay, their savings rate is about 15%. It's not 48%. So I think that's a really important way. Like, you need to be consistent. So again, that's like my accountant's hat putting it on here for a second, is like, not to be mean to people who are doing it this way, but like, I don't think it's the consistency that you really need, which leads us into scenario 3.
Right. So, I mean, you loosely pointed out, we just have to fix the denominator. So if you funded a pre-tax retirement account like a 401k and you maxed it out, in this case, this couple put $20,500 in their 401k. That's being included in the $30,000 that they're counting for savings, but we need to add that back to their take-home pay down in the denominator. So this adjustment would look like on the top, they saved $30,000. That was made up of, what they funded the 401k with, plus the after-tax savings of the 9,500. That's your 30,000. And then the bottom, it is your take-home pay, which in this case was that 62,000 squirrely number, plus the 20,500 that they put into their 401k retirement accounts. And so that math is going to bring you back down from that lofty 48% that we said in scenario 2, but it's still more than scenario 1. It's a 36% savings rate in this case. And it's interesting to point out that in this case, that probably seems more reasonable, but someone may still feel kind of defensive about that, that 48%, that scenario number 2 calculation. And I just want to point out that this is how you could actually break the entire thing. You have a scenario where you've netted out so much from the denominator and you're putting a massive bonus or something into the savings category in the top, but you never saw it, so you're not including it. You could end up with a scenario where you have a 80 or 90, maybe even 100% savings rate, but you're not financially independent. Like, so your calculation, depending on the, how extreme the scenario is, could be completely broken, where it might be kind of hidden if your numbers are a little bit more moderate. You don't want to break your calculation. This is always to inform your trajectory. It's not bragging rights. It's to inform your trajectory.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, anytime you can logically get bizarre results out of something, it probably means the calculation is starting from a fundamentally flawed standpoint. So that's why I think part 2, scenario 2 is not ideal. But I think scenario 3 is kind of like a happy medium here of, okay, clearly that's pretty easy to figure out in essence, but it provides a lot of value. And I think it gets to Ben's question of, okay, is this gross income or net income? And I think how I would look at net income is my gross income net of taxes, because realistically, obviously you have some ability to impact your taxes in terms of, in this case, 401k contributions, pre-tax contributions, things like that. But at the end of the day, you don't have that much ability to impact it when you're making a significant amount of income. We can talk about the nuance of FI and how can we do Roth IRA conversion ladders. And that's all fun and games and is amazing. Obviously, it's a huge benefit of FI, but that's not part of this conversation. We're talking about really your earning years when you're trying to save to get to FI. So for me, when I look at my savings rate, it's really not my fault in essence that I'm paying taxes, right? It is part of life and part of society. So I don't ding myself really in my savings rate calc by including that in my income. So very simply, very, very simply, I just take my gross income, I reduce my tax burden, and that gets to my net income. And that's the denominator in this. So I just take my savings and divide it by that net income, net of taxes, and that gets your percentage. So, in this case, Jonathan, it took them from 30%, which I think is a reasonable starting point of that 30,000 divided by the 100, and got them to 36%, which I think is much more appropriate, right? They saved 30 grand. They had about $82,000 in change to spend, and that's your 36% savings rate. I think that if you wanted to stop right there, I think that's a very reasonable thing, and you've gotten certainly more than we talk about the 80-20 analysis of something. How can I get the vast majority of the benefit out of a small amount of inputs? I think you're good there. But obviously, we don't want to stop there for people who are looking for additional nuance.
But we do want to encourage you to stop there to do that, right? So, we've set up this article for you. This is really meant to be a follow along and take action, get these numbers, have that. So go to chooseavi.com/375, go through the article. If you have questions about how to do that math, we have it all there for you with the different scenarios. Find out what yours is. And then, yeah, exactly, Brad, we can build on this. So do we want to get more nuance? I usually, there's a couple tweaks that we need to make, and we're going to add this in terms of the how hardcore the math is. I stop at equation number 3. A fourth equation that you could do, I do not do this personally, is we could address the fact that pre-tax dollars are not worth the exact same as after-tax dollars, right? So like we just combined the $9,500 in after-tax savings with the $20,500 in pre-tax, but in reality, the pre-tax money is probably going to take around a 12 to 15% haircut, when you're actually drawing down on it. So in a fourth scenario, if we really wanted to do that, we would need to, in the numerator and in the denominator for that, that money that we saved in our 401k, we would need to give it a 15% haircut, which practically means multiplying it times 0.85, just that little piece, and then adding it to the numerator and denominator. Because that change has been made on both sides, it will not dramatically affect that overall percentage, but it will change it slightly. And so if you want to go that much farther, you are yet a little bit closer to your personal savings rate calculation.
Yeah. And I suspect, like you said, people see that on paper on the website, but that's a nuanced understanding, right? That, okay, I have money that I saved in my bank account or in my Vanguard account or something, and that's already been taxed. That's not being taxed again, right? But money that you put into, and really maybe a better way to look at this would be money that you put into a Roth 401k versus a traditional 401k. You might have put the same $20,500 in, but at the heart of it, they are worth different things because the Roth 401k money has already been taxed. So therefore, it's like saving more on your actual gross income as opposed to the traditional 401k that has not been taxed and will be taxed later. So it's actually worth less to you. And it's hard to even conceptualize talking about this, but it's really important that you at least understand that. But to me, and for my personal savings rate calculation, that's a bridge too far. Like that gets into my brain wants to explode and I want to stop doing this and run away. So when I get to that point in any kind of thing, I just take a deep breath and say, okay, the juice is not worth the squeeze here. So I don't look at that level of nuance. I suspect there are people in our community who do. That's not my thing.
And again, because we're not comparing ours to someone else's, it's fine. It's just a personal choice. It's what do you want to do? Stopping at number 3 works for me and it works for Brad in this case. All right, now let's go back and actually talk about some nuance that while it does not affect what calculation we use, it does affect the various inputs. I'll give you one. So we just talked about gross compensation and we quickly zeroed in on how much we're going to put into our 401k. But what about those of you that have an employer match? Don't forget about that. You really rarely even see that. You may not even notice it. Like if your employer put money in as well, that is savings. You should add that to your savings side and you should add it to the denominator as well. This is money that should be included in that calculation. Don't forget about that. So I just said this person's putting $20,500 into their 401k. If they're getting a 5% match, so in many cases, it's a 1-to-1 5% match, that means that their employer is contributing an extra $5,000 on top of the $20,500 that they were putting into the account. Do not lose that. That is both savings, but it also is part of your total compensation, right? So it should affect both the numerator and the denominator. You do not want to leave that out. That is a very, very valuable and important metric. And if this is the reminder for those of you that haven't gotten the employer match, it's literally one of the first places to start. If our employer offers a match, we don't say no to free money. Let's get the match. So Brad, I know we're in agreement on what to do and how to account for the employer match, but what about other factors that are going to affect savings, like what you choose to do with that savings, or when payments that you're making in your regular life are actually reducing debt burden?
Yeah. And this is where we get into, again, that level of nuance that I think is important if you want to go to that level in your calculation. So for me, there's a couple things. So I think it's easy to say, okay, I saved, like in this family's case, I saved the 20,500 in my 401k, but then we had that other 9,500 that we saved. And it's easy to look at, okay, what did I put in my investments? And maybe all of that went to their investments. Okay. So super simple to remember. Hey, we made these transfers throughout the year. We bought this amount of funds and there's our 9,500, right? Okay. But what if, let's say this is kind of random, Jonathan, but it's important to even think about, like, what if their checking account balance went up by 10 grand that year? Okay. They didn't technically invest that money. It might be sitting there, but is that savings? Yeah, I mean, of course it is. Their cash on hand, let's say it went from $3,000 to $13,000. I mean, this isn't realistic, but for some people it might be. Okay, sure, I didn't technically invest that money, but I'm probably going to invest it at some point. So my cash on hand went up. I would include that. I mean, to me, that is savings, because we're really looking for the other part of this calc is, what are your expenses, right? And in this case, that couple didn't have an extra $10,000 of expenses. That was savings that is sitting in their checking account. And I know that might sound a little confusing, but it's just important to really think of, okay, what balances of mine went up that would be construed as savings? And I think a better way to look at this might be debt or your mortgage. And I think this is where a lot of people drill down. And there is some disagreement over this, but I think this is personal preference. And for me, I do include my principal repayments into my numerator, so into my savings, right? So let's say my mortgage payment is $1,500 a month, and about 500 of that goes to principal, which pays down my mortgage balance, and the other 1,000 is spread across interest and then escrow, right, which is home insurance and taxes. So that $1,000 I would consider as expense, just plain and simple. That's money that is essentially burned and gone. It's not coming back. That is expense. But the $500 is really like a forced savings, because you paid that 12 times a year, and it'll go up a little bit. It'll be $501 the next month, 502.5, or something like that. But you'd have to look at your amortization schedule. But again, that's probably getting too far in the weeds. But you have a sense roughly, if you just look at your mortgage payment, how much principal did I pay? So in this case, $500. Jonathan, I think that's savings.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, because it's already in your denominator, because it's based on, you spent the rest. So then how much credit can you give yourself in the numerator? And you're like, yeah, if it paid down debt, if it paid down my mortgage, paid down that principal, then yeah, I 100% agree. Now, this goes to the difference between our savings rate and then mapping our savings rate back to our timeline to FI. So we are, if we're doing our napkin math and we're putting a bunch of static assumptions into this now, it's great as a place to start. Like I could tell you, if you have a 0% savings rate, you can never retire. That's a statistical fact. And I could also say that if you're starting from zero and your investments make a 5% in real return, which seems, pretty reasonable, and you're going to live on the 4% rule on the other side, a 50% savings rate will get you to financial independence from a standing start in 17 years. But most of us either have a negative net worth because they're starting from debt, or we have a positive net worth, right? Very few of us are actually at zero. And the market doesn't just consistently do, 5% in real returns. The market can have back-to-back 20+% years, and then, inflation that moves around, and then negative year. We're talking about over longer timelines, right? So we're just making, we don't know what the future is going to hold. So we're just trying to put reasonable assumptions in place. And then we're trying to use our savings rate as a guide to see where are we at. And then once we have our savings rate, then we need to also recognize the variables that are uniquely ours. And then we can make small adjustments to help us figure out, what does that mean? So for instance, if you're already in your mind 1/3 of the way to financial independence and you track your savings rate and you're still at a 50% savings rate, then you would say, oh, I only have 14 years left, or if you're now much farther ahead than you thought you would be, and you just look at your savings rate for the year and you're this year, it looks like you're actually trending more towards 55 or 60. You're like, what? I think I'm within 10 years. This is a spot check for you to be able to say, am I trending forward? Am I trending backwards? And so it's very useful for us as individuals. And that's kind of like what I'm hoping to communicate to Ben with this question, but also largely for us we're going to be able to build on the structure that we're saying. We're putting a lot of emphasis on the scenario 3 calculation. We're talking about some of the nuance that you'll want to add in with the mortgage, with the debt repayment, how to handle cash. Should you be that? If your idea is that like, hey, my goal is to save in cash and make it to $100,000 or $200,000 in cash, then yeah, that's going to change all of the assumptions, right? But if at the end of the year you have $10,000 in cash and you're wondering, well, what should that mean for my savings rate for the year? Well, you probably have some rules in place at which point this is going to be invested. And even if you're not going to invest it till the following year, I would absolutely still count that towards the savings part of the equation and towards, increasing your savings rate around that. You're going to have additional variables. You're going to be thinking about things like maybe real estate income that didn't come from your employer. How is your pension actually going to affect this? Other passive income streams, variable income streams. I get it. It's personal. But hopefully kind of the rules-based structure that, this is the 95% with the simple calculation that we're pointing you toward. The other 5% can be built on that using a common sense approach that is uniquely yours.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm glad you touched on the income variable there, because we really didn't do a great job of that. We just talked about, for most people have W-2 income, and that's that, right? But there are many people out there who are entrepreneurs or have side hustles, or like you said, had real estate income. Maybe they have Social Security or pension. I would add all of that in to your total income. I think that's pretty clear. There are things that I would not include. Like I wouldn't include my dividends and capital gains on already invested assets. To me, that's completely separate. But I think the actual income I'm earning this year from either quote unquote passive or side hustles, things like that, like unquestionably, those get included in that total income denominator. So yeah, I'm really glad you touched on that here at the end, Jonathan, because it's important. But again, for the vast majority of people, it's going to be W-2 income. That's going to be pretty simple. But if you have a more nuanced or complicated financial life, you have a variety of income sources, which is wonderful, obviously. You should include all that, clearly.
All right, guys. So a couple things there. We are working on a financial independence A to Z series. This is the second article in the series, but really the first one where we've been able to bring in all the amazing things that this team in the back end is doing and all the different ways that we can really tell a story that parallels what we're talking about on, this podcast. We believe this series is going to add a lot of value to your life. We think it's going to be very shareable, and we hope you will check it out. Just go to choosify.com/375. Take action by calculating your own savings rate. And if you're getting value from this podcast and from this article, share it with a friend. We'd love to know the impact that this is having on your life. And also, if you have questions, they really do help us figure out what content to work on next. So if you have a great question like Ben just had, Brad, where can they send that?
Yeah, Jonathan, great question. And the easiest way is to get on our email list, which ultimately gets you my bi-weekly newsletter that I sit down and personally handwrite every Monday. It comes out Tuesday morning. So just head over to choosify.com/subscribe. And every week I ask you to hit reply and let me know what questions you have, like Ben wrote in, or what action you've taken to make your life better. And that's what's so cool about the email, about this community, is we're all sharing these wins together. And it's really the most fun part of the email, is to see what are people in the community doing to make their lives better. And it's so invigorating and fun to read. So choosify.com/subscribe. And then, just hit reply. I read every single reply. So would love to hear from you.
All right, my friends, the fire is spreading. We'll see you next time as we continue to go down the road less traveled.